My daughter called me 3 days before Thanksgiving and said, "Dad, this year is really more of a friends thing. You know how it gets." I said I understood. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. I was 62 years old, and my daughter had just uninvited me from a holiday I'd hosted for 31 years. But before I tell you what happened at midnight on Thanksgiving, because something did happen, something that shook my entire family to its core, you need to understand how a man ends up standing alone in his own kitchen, uninvited from his own life. My name is Gerald Croft. I'm 62 and I live in Millbrook, Ohio, in the same house where my kids grew up. Same driveway where my son Ryan learned to ride a bike. Same back porch where my daughter Claire used to do her homework on summer evenings, barefoot, lemonade sweating on the railing beside her. Before you judge what I did, and some of you will, I need you to know what it cost me to do it. And I need you to know that I didn't make the decision alone. I made it with the only person I've ever trusted completely. My wife Carol died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by September. 7 months from the words "we need to talk about your scan" to the morning I sat beside her bed in our room listening to the silence after 34 years of her breathing beside me. Carol was the one who kept us together, not in a fragile way, not in the way where you realize after someone's gone that the whole thing was held together with tape and her stubbornness. She genuinely loved us all, and she made loving each other easy. Sunday dinners with the real china she never saved for special occasions. Birthday phone calls she started at exactly midnight because she said the first voice you hear on your birthday matters. Cards that arrived a day early so you'd never wonder if she forgot. When she was gone, I learned very quickly that a family without its center doesn't automatically hold. Ryan was the first to change. My son is 40, lives in Columbus, runs a commercial real estate firm with his name on the door. Sharp, driven, the kind of man who gets things done by deciding they're already done. After Carol died, he was attentive for about 3 months. Calls every few days, checking in, asking if I needed anything. Then the calls went to once a week, then every couple of weeks. Then texts, and not real texts. Just forwarded jokes or a thumbs up when I shared something with him. The last time I called him and he answered on the second ring was 8 months after the funeral. Claire is 37, teaches elementary school in Dayton, which I always thought suited her because she has Carol's patience and her capacity to make people feel genuinely seen. After her mother died, Claire came to stay with me for a week. She organized Carol's closet, which I couldn't bring myself to touch. She labeled things. She cried with me on the back porch 2 nights in a row, and I thought we understood each other. Then she went back to Dayton, and slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice. She began to disappear, too. It wasn't cruel. That's what I want you to understand. Nobody was cruel to me directly. It was something quieter, and in some ways harder. I became irrelevant. Christmas plans were made without consulting me. When they eventually told me, it was presented as settled, not as a question. I was invited to Ryan's daughter's birthday party via a group text that went to 40 other people. At family dinners, I was asked about my health and the weather in Millbrook and nothing else. When I offered opinions about anything, there was this brief pause, polite but pointed, and then the conversation moved on. What none of them knew was that I had been working. After Carol died, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in our bed and the quiet was unbearable, so I'd get up and go to the spare room where I kept my books and my drafting table and my old laptop, and I'd work. I'm a structural engineer, 40 years in the field. I spent the first 30 at a firm in Columbus, the last 10 consulting independently, which my kids thought meant I was winding down, slowing down. They were wrong. For 11 years I'd been developing a proprietary load distribution system for modular construction, a structural framework that could reduce building costs by 30% and construction time by nearly half while maintaining safety standards that exceeded current code. Carol had believed in it completely. On our last good evening, about 5 weeks before the end, we sat on the back porch and I walked her through the diagrams, and she said, "Gerald, this is going to matter long after we're both gone." She said it like she knew she was already leaving. I'd kept it quiet. Engineers are not naturally secretive people, but I'd watched colleagues lose years of work to institutional ownership disputes, and I was careful. I had a patent attorney named Margaret Finley, who I'd worked with twice before. I filed the initial patents in stages. By the time Carol died, the core framework was protected. By the following April, I had provisional protection on the full system. My children didn't know, not because I was hiding it from them. I tried to explain it at Christmas 2 years before Carol died, and Ryan had said, "That sounds really complex." "Dad, in a tone that meant he wasn't interested, and Claire had smiled in that way she had when she was humoring me. I stopped trying to explain. I kept working. Now, here's where you need to pay attention, because this is where the story changes. 6 months after Carol's death, Ryan called me with that particular energy he gets when he's already decided something. He said he was considering expanding his real estate business into modular development. He said the construction side was where the real margin was. He said he'd been talking to some people. He said, "Dad, you know this space. I'd love your thoughts. What do you know about modular structural systems?" I loved him. I wanted to help him. I told him what I knew, which was considerable, and I was careful about what I shared. I mentioned my framework only in general terms, the way you describe an idea that isn't fully formed yet, because Margaret had been very clear, don't disclose specifics to anyone without documentation. But I walked him through the principles, the efficiency gains, the engineering logic. He asked good questions. I felt for the first time in months like my son was actually listening to me. 3 months later, he called again. Different tone, more formal. He said he had an opportunity and he needed to move quickly, and that he'd taken some of my concepts and built them into a pitch for a development group out of Cincinnati. He said he hoped I didn't mind. He said it was still in the early stages. He said family is family. I called Margaret the next morning. She pulled up the description Ryan had included in a preliminary investor memo that one of his partners, a man I'd never met named Douglas, had forwarded to a mutual contact of ours who happened to be a structural engineer and who had immediately called me. It was my framework. Not similar to my framework. Not inspired by my framework. My framework described in different words with my son's company logo at the top of the page. Margaret was calm the way lawyers are when they're very certain. She said, "Your patents cover this completely." She said we needed to document everything immediately. She said I should not confront Ryan yet, not until we had full documentation in order. I didn't confront him. I kept showing up to family things, Easter at Claire's, where Ryan and I sat on the same side of the table, and he told a story about a new development deal, and everyone laughed. The 4th of July, where Ryan's daughter Emma sat in my lap for 20 minutes and showed me a video of a dog that could skateboard. A Sunday in September where we all met at a restaurant in Columbus and I ordered the salmon and nodded along to a conversation about a school Ryan was considering for Emma. Nobody asked me anything real. Nobody said, "Dad, how are you actually doing?" Nobody asked what I was working on. I was 62 and a widower, and I made people sad in some vague ambient way that was hard to name, and the easiest solution was to include me just enough that nobody felt guilty. Then came November. Claire called on a Tuesday. She said the Thanksgiving plan this year was different, more relaxed, just close friends who needed somewhere to go. She said Ryan agreed it would be better, less complicated. She said they'd figure out a time in December, maybe a smaller dinner, maybe just the 3 of us. She said, "I hope you understand, Dad." I said I understood. I hung up and stood in Carol's kitchen and looked at the copper pot she'd used for cranberry sauce every year for 26 years, hanging on the rack above the stove where she'd always hung it, and I thought about what she'd say. She would have been furious on my behalf, but she also would have said, "Gerald, don't do this in anger. Do it for the right reasons and at the right time." I called Margaret. She said she was ready when I was. I reached out to a journalist named Patricia Wu. She wrote for an engineering industry publication out of Washington and had covered intellectual property disputes in construction for 15 years. I'd read her work. I trusted her precision. We met for coffee at a diner in Columbus on a Thursday, November 18th. I brought everything. Patents with filing dates, the original investor memo with Ryan's company logo, Margaret's legal analysis, emails from Douglas, the partner, which my mutual contact had forwarded to me. Time-stamped documentation going back 4 years. Patricia took notes for 90 minutes. Then she looked up and said, "This is significant, not just professionally. You understand what publishing this does." I said I did. She said the piece would run online at midnight on Thanksgiving. She said she chose the date because it was when the most people would be awake and the news would travel fastest. I said that was fine. I drove home through Millbrook in the dark. The town looked the same as it always did. The diner where Carol and I used to get breakfast on Saturday mornings. The park where Ryan learned to throw a baseball. The library where Claire had done homework for 4 years straight and the librarian knew her by name. I drove past all of it and I felt something I can only describe as grief and certainty existing in the same space, which is not as contradictory as it sounds. Thanksgiving arrived. My friend Harold, who I've known since we were both young engineers at the same firm, came to have dinner with me. He brought a store-bought pie and a bottle of wine, which he set on the kitchen counter and said, "I figure you could use the company." I had told him what I'd done. He hadn't tried to talk me out of it. He'd said, "You gave them the chance to do this differently, and they didn't take it. That matters." We ate. Turkey I'd made from a recipe Carol left written on an index card in her handwriting, which I still can't look at without my throat closing. Green beans, the cranberry sauce from the copper pot. Harold told a story about a project he'd consulted on in Phoenix that had gone so wrong that the whole thing became a case study in a graduate engineering course. We laughed. It felt strange to laugh that day, but it also felt like something Carol would have wanted. At 11:30, Harold and I sat at the kitchen table with our coffee. He said, "You sure about this?" I looked at the copper pot on the rack. I looked at the index card in Carol's handwriting on the refrigerator door. I looked at the window where you could see the back porch where she used to sit in the evenings. I said, "I've been erased from my own family's life. My work is being used without my knowledge or my credit. I've watched my son present my ideas as his own to investors and not say a word, not because I was afraid, but because I loved him enough to believe he'd do the right thing eventually. He didn't, so yes, I'm sure." Harold raised his coffee cup. "To Carol," he said quietly. "To Carol," I agreed. Midnight. My phone came alive. The article had gone live. Margaret had sent me the link at 11:58. I read the headline sitting at my kitchen table with Harold beside me. Structural engineer alleges son's firm used patented framework in developer pitch without credit or disclosure. My name. Ryan's name. Documentation that could not be disputed. At 12:07, Ryan called. I answered. His voice was not calm. It was that voice people have when they're genuinely frightened, not performing fright but actually afraid. The voice that strips away the professional polish and the practice confidence and leaves something roar underneath. "Dad, what did you do?" I told him the truth, I said. He said this was going to destroy him. He said it wasn't what I thought. He said he'd been planning to talk to me about attribution. He said there were a dozen explanations, though he didn't give me one. He said I'd ambushed him on a holiday. He said I'd done this deliberately to humiliate him. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "Ryan, I asked you once, 3 months after you first called me for my expertise. I asked you directly whether you intended to document my contributions, and you said family doesn't need contracts. I gave you the opportunity to do this right. You decided it wasn't necessary." Silence. Then, my voice quiet, "I want you to hear something. I am your father. I built a career for 40 years. I am not a resource you use when it's convenient and set aside when it isn't. Your mother believed in my work when you didn't think to ask about it. I protected that work legally because Margaret told me to and because somewhere I already knew what was coming. And I held my tongue through Easter and the 4th of July and every dinner where no one asked me a single real question, because I still believed you'd find your way back to who I raised you to be." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Dad, I said, "I'm not angry, Ryan. I'm heartbroken. There's a difference." And then I hung up. Claire called at 12:22. Her voice was shaking in a different way, less frightened, more wounded. She said she hadn't known about the framework or the patent. I believed her. She said she didn't understand why I hadn't just talked to them. I said I'd tried, and that sometimes talking to someone requires them to be listening, and that for 2 years I had been invited to their lives as decoration and not as a person, and that Carol would have found a gentler way to say all of this, and that Carol wasn't here. She was crying by the end of that sentence. I said, "Claire, I love you. None of this changes that, but I have to be someone I can live with." And I hung up. Harold drove home at 1 in the morning. I sat alone in Carol's kitchen with the lights off, the copper pot on the rack, the index card on the refrigerator, the quiet that was different from grief quiet, which is empty, and more like the quiet after something necessary, which has its own weight but doesn't hollow you out. The article spread quickly. By morning it had been picked up by 2 engineering trade journals and a construction industry newsletter with a large readership. By the next day, 3 other engineers had contacted Margaret with questions about similar situations. Patricia Wu wrote a follow-up piece the following week. Ryan's Cincinnati Development Group issued a statement saying they were reviewing all materials and pausing the project pending clarification, which is what organizations say when they're trying to determine how serious the problem is. Ryan's business partner, Douglas, reached out to Margaret directly and asked whether we intended to pursue litigation. Margaret said we were exploring all options, which is what lawyers say when they want the other side to worry. In the second week of December, Ryan called again. Not the panicked call from midnight. A different call. Earlier in the morning, quieter, like he'd been sitting with something for days. He said, "I want to understand what I actually did to you." I said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it, not just the patent. I've been thinking about what you said, about being decoration." He paused. "Is that really what it felt like?" I said, "Ryan, your mother spent 34 years making sure that everyone in this family knew they were seen. When she died, I thought we'd hold on to that because she taught us all how. I was wrong. In the 2 years since she's been gone, I've been consulted about the weather and my blood pressure and nothing else. I stopped existing as a person to you. I became a problem to manage." He was quiet. He said, "I didn't know I was doing that." I said, "I know you didn't. That's the part that's hardest to forgive." We talked for an hour. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was something more preliminary than that. Something that felt like two people agreeing to stop pretending and starting from there. He said he wanted to do something to make the patent situation right. I told him that was between his attorneys and Margaret, but that what I actually needed had nothing to do with the law. He asked what I needed. I said, "I need you to call me on a Tuesday for no reason. I need you to ask me what I'm working on and actually want to know. I need to be at Thanksgiving next year, not because nobody could think of an excuse to exclude me, but because someone thought of an excuse to make sure I was there." Long pause. He said, "Okay." We hung up. I don't know yet what okay means. I've been a father long enough to know that the distance between a word and a change is longer than it looks. But I also know that 2 years ago he wouldn't have called to ask. He would have sent a lawyer. Margaret negotiated a formal attribution and licensing agreement with Ryan's firm in January. My name on the framework. A royalty structure that acknowledged the origin of the intellectual property. It wasn't punitive. I wasn't trying to ruin him. I was trying to exist. The article led to other things. A speaking invitation at a regional engineering conference in March, where I gave a 40-minute talk on intellectual property protection for independent contractors. A consulting engagement with a firm in Pittsburgh that had found my work through Patricia's coverage. A letter from a retired engineer in Arizona who said he'd fought the same battle 20 years earlier and lost, and that reading my story made him feel like it hadn't been entirely in vain. Carol would have read that letter 4 times. She would have put it somewhere safe. I found a place for it in the drawer where I keep her index card. Thanksgiving came again. Ryan had rented a house in Millbrook, which surprised me. He said he wanted to come to where we were instead of expecting everyone to come to him. Claire drove up from Dayton. Emma, Ryan's daughter, who is 9 now and has taken to calling me every Sunday to report on what she's been reading, arrived wearing a sweater with a turkey on it that she described as very important to the occasion. Harold came. Margaret came, which I hadn't expected. She said she'd never missed a Thanksgiving she'd been invited to, and she wasn't starting now. We were crowded in Carol's kitchen, which is not a large kitchen, and someone knocked over the salt and someone else couldn't find the serving spoon, and Emma decided the cranberry sauce needed to be stirred again even though it had already been stirred, and it was loud and imperfect and nothing at all like the quiet I'd spent last Thanksgiving in. Ryan stood beside me at the stove at one point, just the 2 of us, while everything else was happening around us. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About Mom making it easy." I said, "She did." He said, "I think I used that as an excuse, that it was her job, keeping us together. After she died, I didn't know how to do it myself, so I stopped trying." I looked at the copper pot on the rack, said, "Your mother would say that's the most honest thing you've ever told me." He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him. It sounded like him at 12, which was the last time I remembered him laughing without meaning to. I said, "It's a start." After dinner, Emma found the index card on the refrigerator. Carol's handwriting, the turkey recipe smudged at the corner where I'd touched it too many times. Emma asked who wrote it. I said her grandmother. Emma looked at it for a long time, this 9-year-old with serious eyes, and then she got a piece of paper from the drawer and a pen, and she said, "Teach me the recipe. I want to learn it." So we sat at Carol's kitchen table, Emma and I, while everyone else cleaned up and talked and moved around us, and I taught her the recipe. She wrote it down in careful, deliberate letters, the handwriting of someone who is still learning that words are important. When she finished, she held it up. "Is that right, Grandpa?" I looked at it, looked at her. "That's exactly right," I said. She folded the paper and tucked it in the front pocket of her very important turkey sweater. I watched her run back to find her father, and I sat there in the kitchen for a moment alone, the quiet that comes not from absence but from fullness, from a room where things are being built instead of lost. I thought about Carol, the way she used to say this at the end of a good evening, When everyone had gone home and the dishes were done and we'd sit together in the not quite dark and she'd say, "Well, we did all right today." As if every day was a project. As if doing all right was itself an achievement worth naming. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it. We did all right today. I'm not going to tell you that what I did was painless or that justice is clean or that the right thing always leads to the right ending. It doesn't. I cost my son professionally, and that cost radiated outward to people who didn't deserve it, and I carry that. I lost time with my children during years when time is not a thing you can afford to lose, and I carry that too. But I'll tell you what I know. I know that silence does not preserve a family. It just delays the accounting. I know that being loved by someone really loved, seen and known and valued is not something you can outsource to one person in a family and assume it continues after they're gone. It has to be practiced by everyone. Every day. Like a recipe you write down and learn and carry with you so it doesn't disappear. I know that 62 is not old. I know that a lifetime of expertise does not expire. I know that the voice you've been swallowing for the sake of keeping the peace will come out eventually, and it's better to choose when and how than to let it choose for you. And I know that the best things in my life right now, a Sunday phone call from my granddaughter about whatever book she's reading, a kitchen full of people who chose to come, a piece of paper in a turkey sweater pocket cost me the willingness to stop disappearing. If you've been made invisible by the people who should see you most, hear this. You are not a relic. You are not obsolete. You are not a problem to be managed at the end of a table. You are someone Carol would have known how to celebrate. And if she can't do it anymore, then you have to do it yourself. Even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. That's how she would have said it. That's what I'm still learning to believe. If any part of this stayed with you, if you've been there, if you're there right now, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and tell me one thing you're still holding on to that maybe you should let go. I read every single one. Subscribe if you want more true stories about what it really costs to stand up for yourself. Not the easy version, the real version. The one that takes something from you and gives you something else in return. I'll see you in the next one.